All right, I want to talk about the idea of market structures. Little basics video here. There are, let's see here. It's a way to differentiate different types of industries based on the number of sellers in the industry, from one with many sellers, perhaps millions, to one seller. And not every industry or company fits exactly on this model, but we have sort of four groupings in general to distribute companies in based on the number of sellers. On the extreme left, we have pure competition. That means thousands, hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of sellers. Then we have monopolistic competition, which is a lot of sellers. Oligopoly is a few sellers, and pure monopoly is one seller, obviously. Let's look at each of these. Pure competition. What are the characteristics of this market structure? Well, a very large number of sellers. The stock market, for example, there are millions of people who are willing to sell shares of certain stock in the market, and so that is a pure competition. Farm commodities, things like pork bellies, frozen concentrated orange juice, bananas, stuff like that. Number two, these are by definition standardized products. My share of apple is just as good as your share of apple. A banana is a banana, gas is gas, milk is milk. So competition is therefore based on price, as the products are essentially sort of the same, which makes the buyers and sellers price takers. A single seller or buyer can't influence the price, and so therefore they're called price takers. There's free entry and exit into this sort of market. In other words, starting the business or shutting down and getting out of the business. Very, very easy. Very few barriers. We'll talk about what that means in a minute. And so to the degree there's any non-price competition in a structure, for pure competition, there's really none. You can't differentiate and charge more based on service or brand name or quality. You can try to a little bit, but again, gas is gas, tires are tires, milk is milk. Continuing with pure monopoly, or going to the other end of the spectrum, there is only a single seller. That's the definition, mono. There are no close substitutes. Buyers need to buy from the monopolist or do without. The monopolist is therefore a price maker. He can set the price. That's why you want to be a monopoly. Blocked entry. The barriers are so stiff they keep competitors completely out. Sometimes this is what gives the monopolist his advantage. I'll give some examples in a second. And so non-price competition depends. Some monopolistic products are kind of standardized, like electricity. In any given area, the electricity company is a monopoly. Or it can be differentiated. Frisbees, some kind of special trademarked product, in which case there would be price competition based on advertising and stuff. It depends. Pure monopolies are rare. Just like there are no true command economies or true capitalist economies. There are really very few true monopolies, but the close examples are numerous. As I mentioned, in most cities, utilities, gas, water, electricity, they're either government-owned or regulated by the government. There are numerous near monopolies where one firm controls the bulk of sales. Intel, at one point, controlled about 80% of the PC chips in the world. This is not true anymore, but I recall years ago, Microsoft had about 90% of the share of small computer operating systems. Pro sports teams are, in a sense, monopolies because they're the sole suppliers of a specific sport or service in a geographic area. There are geographic monopolies created when, for instance, only one airline serves a small city. Or let's say I own a gravel pit, a place where big trucks come to get big dump trucks to get gravel, which is useful for many construction purposes. Well, it's very expensive to haul rock like that. And so if I have the only gravel pit within a 50-mile radius, I kind of have a monopoly. So that's an example as well. Barriers to entry. Anything that prevents entry of firms into an industry. If barriers are high, you have a monopoly. Or excuse me, if barriers are absolute, you have a monopoly. If barriers are very low, you have pure competition. And there are four categories of barriers. One is economies of scale. Modern technology in some economies, such as economies of scale, are extensive. Given market demand, only a few large firms can achieve a low average total cost. For example, if you want to just open a business building rockets, that probably wouldn't work. Giant production is necessary, and that would be a barrier to entry. Legal barriers. Governments create barriers to, like patents. Why would they do that? Well, to encourage people to innovate new drugs. The patents will expire eventually, but while the patent is in force, no other company can make this drug without paying money to the monopolist. Or licenses. Government may limit entry into an industry or occupation through licenses, like licenses for your radio station, or taxi cabs are heavily regulated and licensed in a place like New York City. And there are reasons they do this. The third category is ownership or control of an essential resource. A monopolist can use private property as an obstacle to potential rivals. The company Inco controls 90% of the world's nickel reserves. At one point, it's not true anymore, but at one point, a syndicate of companies called the De Beers Syndicate controlled about 90% of the world's diamonds. So, that's not really anti-competitive business. That's just they own the resource. 4, pricing and other strategic barriers to entry. A monopolist may create entry barriers to a new competitor by slashing its prices, stepping up its advertising, or other strategic actions. One of the greatest monopolists in history, John D. Rockefeller, who's also the richest human to have ever lived, he became a monopolist in oil pumping in America, and pumping, refining, and distribution of oil through rather ruthless practices. Let's say you have a smaller refinery over here, and he slashes his price to a point that he's going to lose money. Rockefeller does. And because of his scale, he can afford to take that loss longer than the other guy can, and he drives the other guy out of business and then comes in and says, well, I'll buy your business, giving him more power to continue to do that in the future. That's illegal in America, but that's a strategic barrier. What about the other two structures? Monopolistic competition. That is, you have a fairly large number of sellers, 25 to 70, for example, but not hundreds or thousands. Differentiated products. Think blue jeans, all right? They're not all the same. And therefore, the monopolistic competitors have some control over price because the products are different. Pretty easy entry and exit. You don't have to get a license or get a patent to start making blue jeans. And non-price competition is pretty high. People seek to differentiate their product through the use of advertising. So this is common in monopolistic competition. What about product differentiation? Well, you can sort of differentiate and hopefully charge more for your product in a number of ways. Product attributes, physical or qualitative differences in the product. Lucky jeans are better than Wranglers. Service, level of quality of service and how the products are sold. Publix, high level of service versus Food Giant. Not to pick on Food Giant, but I've not been there many years, and in my mind, my memory, it's not the level of service at Publix. Location. Now, I'm going to pay more for a bottle of aspirin at Walgreens than I would at Walmart. But if I happen to be right next to the Walgreens, I can just run in, run out. It's a few cents more. Who cares? I'm getting utility of convenience. And then finally, there's some control over price. If consumers prefer one product's unique aspects, they may pay more for it within limits. I'm not going to pay $5,000 for a pair of blue jeans, but I might pay $500. Not me personally, you understand. The final structure is oligopoly. This is a very few, but very large sellers. It's necessarily a vague definition, since they range from the range between monopolistic competition and pure monopoly is so big, so it's kind of nebulous. These companies can be trading either homogeneous or differentiated products. Copper, aluminum, cement, those are like commodities. But the creation of these products it entails huge economies of scale. So they're barriers, but they're still commodities. They're the same. But cars, breakfast cereals, cigarettes, those are differentiated. And by the way, those things are controlled by a handful of very large, very small number of companies. And therefore, there is considerable control over price. But sellers must take into account the reaction of their competitors. Burger King and McDonald's, Burger King wants to raise the price of their hamburger 20 cents. And they have to think about, well, how will McDonald's react to this? It's called game theory. We'll talk more about it in a future video. And so non-price competition is pretty high. Big emphasis on advertising, brand names, trademarks for the differentiated oligopolies. For those that are homogeneous, like copper, aluminum, obviously not so much. This is a useful chart. You might want to screen print this and save it. It's a good summary of all the things we've just talked about. And we will. Those are the basics. But let's continue learning about market structures.